I've decided to start a new series of videos called Panel Focus, where I'm basically going to be going over all aspects of fire alarm panels one by one. And rather than the typical shaky camera movements and sort of moving through everything 100 miles an hour, I'm going to be going over everything very clearly and slowly, because this series of videos is really targeted for anyone who's maybe interested in learning more about fire alarm systems and individual panels. So I'm going to be starting with a very interesting panel, the EST QuickStart, and the system is pretty clearly laid out as far as what all the functions do. So let's get started. Let's start by taking a look at how this panel is powered. So right here we have the low voltage transformer, and basically what this does is it takes the 120 volt AC building current that comes into the panel and converts it to the 24 volts DC that the panel needs to run. So up here we have a Romex connection with the high voltage current that goes under this little protection card. It then goes into the transformer, and then the DC low voltage current goes back up to the power supply. Over to the right we have the secondary power source for the panel. These are two 12 volt 8 amp hour batteries, which kick on in the event of a power failure automatically. And if you don't already know, there are two ways to wire batteries, in parallel and in series. If you were to wire these two batteries in series, you would get 16 amp hours, but they would still only be 12 volts, which is not enough to power the system. So instead we have them wired in series, which then keeps the 8 amp hour rating, but ups the voltage to 24 volts DC. And the way you would wire batteries in series is you take the negative connection from one battery and the positive connection from another, then wire the negative on one battery to the positive of the other, and that will double the voltage. The QuickStart is a semi-modular fire alarm panel, which means that although all models come with a base configuration and a standard keypad, it can be expanded with the addition of extra modules. Now this QuickStart is configured very simply. We've basically got two modules here. And the QuickStart comes in three different models. There's the QSC, which is an all-conventional panel that has the keypad with a slightly smaller LCD display. There's the QS1, which is a single-loop addressable system that comes in a much smaller cabinet. And this model is the QS4, which is by far the most expandable. You can install several SLIC cards as well as conventional cards too. So the first card we have here is the PS6 power supply module. You'll find one of these in every QuickStart system, and it basically is the input for both power supply sources that I showed you before, as well as all the standard inputs and outputs that any fire alarm panel would need. So these red wires going to these terminals here is for the battery connection. We have auxiliary power, three different outputs, and right now these are used for powering the SLIC card that's sitting next to it. We have four programmable relays, and these relays are only programmable through the QuickStart software. And if you don't have the software, they will just function as default. I believe it's alarm, trouble, supervisory, and something else that I forget. You have the smoke auxiliary power. You have the RS-232 and RS-485 connections. The RS-232 is how you program the panel with a cable. And that about does it for the PS6 card. Now the SLIC card basically gives you one addressable loop down here, as well as two notification appliance circuits. And I have two of these cards, but only one of them is installed because that's really all I need. And these terminals down here, you have the riser in and out connection, and that's basically how this card is powered. Now what's interesting is that the notification appliance circuits can be powered in two different ways. They can either be powered through this auxiliary power source, or they can be powered through the small amount of power that's sent through this little bus connection here. And you can select that with these dip switches here. Now I'm not exactly sure why you can select this. One of them may be FWR power, one of them might not be. I've never really check to see the difference between the two, but I have it set to, I think, auxiliary power, because that's what the manual recommended if you have strobes on that circuit. Now, the QuickStart can be easily expanded using this little bus connector here. You basically just attach a card to this little track, slide it down, and connect it to the bus. Now, this is a pretty non-standard setup we have here, very much not up to code, but it's basically just a quick way to put these two SIGA modules somewhere. I just have them duct taped to the panel. And what addressable modules do is, if you have a conventional hardwired device on your system that does not have an addressable module in it, or if you even have an addressable pull station from a different vendor where you can separate the addressable module and just use it as a switch, you can connect it to one of these, which will give it an addressable point on the SLC. And these two modules, these are, I believe, the CT2 model, and they actually give you 2 circuits per module. So I'm using 3 of them. I have the resistors installed at the terminals, which you would never do in a real life safety application, because the end-of-line resistors are what allow the loop to be supervised. Basically, if the panel sees that they're there all the way at the last device, it knows that the line is okay. But if it does not detect that resistance at the last device, it creates a trouble. So I just have them installed at the terminal just for the sake of ease, but you should never do that in a real-life safety application. Here is the door of the QuickStart panel. There's not a whole lot to see here. Basically, this contains the CPU and the back of the keypad. And the only time you would ever really need to remove that is if the CPU failed, or if you wanted to install these right here, which what these are is if you want to have zone enunciation, LED zone enunciation on the front of the panel, which is required in Canada, you can connect that to the CPU. And down here we've got our typical labels, UL listing, and a common practice you see on fire alarm panels is to write down one of the lower level codes as well as the account number, so the service company knows which account this panel is assigned to. And as you can see, it was 8070. That was the level 3 code on the panel when I got it, but I've since changed it back to the default. Here's the front of the QuickStart panel. We have our EST logo, which is actually removable because these panels are commonly rebranded by other brands, including Mirtone and ADT. So you can just quickly swap it out and slap on a different logo. And as I mentioned, you can install LED zone enunciators on the panel. This right here is where they would go. I don't have any installed, although it would kind of be nice to put some in there, but they're quite expensive on eBay. And then over to the left is the keypad. Now, pretty much everything under this door requires a passcode to use, or this little firefighter's key if you have one. I don't have one of those keys, so I just use the level 2 or level 3 password if I need to. But let's zoom in and take a closer look at what everything does. Here's the main LCD display, and it may be difficult to see exactly what it says with my camera, but as we go through some of the menus, I'll zoom in. And we've got 2 sets of arrows right here for up and down scrolling. And let's go over the LEDs. Right here we have the alarm LED. This actually has 3 LEDs under one little plastic lens there, and this will basically flash when an alarm condition comes in. We have supervisory, which is used in a supervisory event. And basically, a supervisory condition is anything you want to supervise that the panel wouldn't already. So for example, sprinkler pressure meters are commonly connected to the supervisory zone. So if the water pressure falls below the accepted level, it has some way to let you know, which is through the panel. Disable test basically lights up when you disable a point or a zone on the panel, and test will light up if you initiate a walk test. you pretty much only see the monitor light on EST panels. And what that basically tells you is when the panel is doing something, processing some sort of information. The only time I've ever seen that turn on is when you first start the panel and it has to initialize the SIGA circuits. Trouble, I think most of you know what that means. That's if the system encounters a problem somewhere in the wiring, or if there's an addressable device that is not programmed into the system, or if there's an addressable device that's missing, or if there's a power fault, so on and so forth. Ground fault will light if there's a dead short to ground somewhere in the system's wiring. Contrary to popular belief, this really doesn't have anything to do with the earth ground on the power supply. This is if one of the wires in the system's wiring has been nicked and it's touching something metal that is ultimately going straight to the ground. CPU fault, this unfortunately lights up quite a lot on QuickStart systems around the world because these QS 1.8 version panels have been known to fail quite a lot, but that's basically if the CPU fails. Doesn't always mean that the panel is cooked. It happened one time on mine. All I had to do was restart it and it turned right back on. The database was lost, but I just created a new one. And then the power light, that's on as long as the AC power is on. Let's move down. We have the help button, which looks all nice and friendly. It looks like it actually is going to tell people in the building what to do in the event of emergency. It really doesn't. I honestly don't know why they called this help. I think all it really does is, like, if there's a trouble, it will basically give you a little bit more information, such as the address of the device and the type of trouble there is. But they still didn't quite make this panel as user-friendly as they should have. And the status button, that basically gives you a menu of various functions you can check to monitor the status of the panel. So you can monitor all active conditions, alarms, supervisory trouble. You can get a list of all disabled points. You can see the status of the outputs as well as the internal status, which will basically meter certain things such as the smoke detector power, auxiliary power levels. You can measure the battery voltage and the AC power voltage. And then we've got the panel silence/acknowledge button. This is just pretty simple. Basically shuts off the panel's internal beeper when a condition comes in. And when you do that, the panel silence light will turn on. Now let's move down to that row that is only accessible through a passcode or the key switch. We've got system reset. You basically will press this button when you've pretty much wrapped up an alarm condition and you're ready to restore the panel to normal. You have alarm silence, which will silence the notification appliance circuits. You have the drill button, which will sound the notification appliance circuits without calling the central station, or in some cases you could program it to not activate, like the door closure relays or HVAC shutdown. In some cases, if you want to test that, you can program it. It's completely up to the user. You have the menu button. This basically takes you into the panel's main menu. And then you have the delete and enter buttons. These pretty much do exactly as they would on a computer keyboard. The delete button will get you back from a menu. The enter button will submit something you've selected. And then you have this numeric keypad here. Now this little thing, you can remove this and you will see there is an Ethernet port. Or actually, excuse me, that's a RJ11 port. And what you can do is connect, you know what, I think that might be an Ethernet port, I can't really tell. But you can connect a barcode scanner to the system. And if you don't already know, EST addressable devices, in fact I will remove one here, have barcodes on the back. And that's basically to make programming a large number of devices at once a lot easier. You can just plug in a barcode scanner to the panel and just scan them like you would at the grocery store. In fact, there are a number of different ways of programming addressable devices into an EST panel, which I will get to that later. And the trouble finally comes in after I've just put the device back. These panels are quite slow, by the way. Let's take a look at some of the menus on the QuickStart. So I'm just going to hit the main menu button to get us into the menu. And I'm already logged into level 4, which is the programming level. And you'll see we have a whole list of options. We have status, which I already showed you. We have reports, which you can generate a number of different reports to monitor the panel's history. Maintenance will basically show you all dirty smoke detectors. History shows you pretty much everything that's happened to the panel recently, or since pretty much the beginning of time until you clear it. This asks you to enter the panel's ID number, which, because this is the only panel on the network, it will always be 01. Oops, it kicked us out. Let's go back to history and enter. If you have a printer connected, you can print this out, but I'm just going to put it on the LCD display. And it will show you the login we just did, local trouble reset. That's from when we put the smoke detector back. And you can just keep going down the list. So let's get back. Revisions shows you the version of the software that's running on the panel. You can see it's version 1.8. And then alarm history, which just shows you the number of alarms that have happened on the panel. And that's also shown on the main screen. And on the main screen, it'll say system is normal if there are no conditions. And we've got the time and date. And the time is always in military time. So let's get back to the menu. And we've got tests. You can just do a lamp test. Let's do that real quick. And this is basically just to check that all the LEDs are working and that the screen doesn't have any dead pixels. I don't even know if you'd use the word pixels to describe a screen like this. But you can also do walk tests. And on an EST panel, it works a little bit differently. You can actually create a testing group, service group as it calls it. I'm not going to go into that right now. But we can then enable and disable points. This is basically if you're doing work on the system or you're doing work that may cause a lot of dust or sawdust, you can disable a smoke detector. So if we wanted to do that, we could disable a zone, which if you have zones set up, that basically comprises a number of different devices into sort of one group. But I don't have any zones set up since I just have a few things connected to this. We can go by device, card, group, which will, that's for notification appliances. We don't have any switches connected to the system, and loop mapping, which that's kind of overkill for a system this size. So let's just go to device. And this is how all devices are identified. The first 2-digit number here is the number of the panel, which is 01. Next we'll enter in the card number, which since we only have one SLIC card, it's 01. And the number of the device, which I'm not entirely sure if there's an 001 on this panel, but let's just check. No, there is not. Actually, yes, there is. It just disabled it. So you can see now that's generated a trouble, and we've got a disabled trouble. Let's go back and enable that. So we just pretty much do the same thing. Device 01 001. Enter, and the trouble goes away. Right here we've got activate and restore. This is if you want to manually set off just an individual output, which includes a notification appliance or a relay. So let's do that. Let's set off the voice evacuation. So that's device number 270, which NAC 1 on the SLIC card is 270, NAC 2 is 271. Let's set it off. Actually, you have a few more options here. You go on, you can set it, latch it, do a low priority, medium priority, high priority event. Let's just set it on. And now let's disable it or restore it.
Attention, attention, an emergency has been reported in this building.
it's off. And then we get into programming. So, as I mentioned, this is the level 4 access level. You'll need to get to that level to do any configuration. You don't need to get into level 4 just to do simple time and date or password programming. But let's go into configure mode. And it's going to disable the entire fire alarm system while we're programming. So you can see it had to take a minute there to disable the SIGA circuits. Now we're into the programming menu. So we have auto learn, which this is a very nice feature. This will basically, if it's your first time setting up this panel, it will go through and auto detect all the cards you have installed. It auto loop, which is sort of a subsection of that feature, will actually program in all your SLC devices, which is very handy. You've got your system options. This is pretty simple. You have user labels, which those can't really be programmed from the front panel. You have to get a laptop, but that's for the names of the devices on the systems. And you have a few other options like AC power delay that sets that if you don't want to have the trouble kick in immediately after it loses power, you can set a slight delay so it'll wait and see if the power comes back on before going into trouble. You've got the cards option. This is where most of the programming on this system is done. So you go into cards and you have 3 options: add, edit, or delete. So we're going to go to edit, and let's edit card 1 since that's the only card on the system. We can configure the card, we can configure detectors, modules, we can auto loop. As I mentioned, that will gather all the SLC devices on the loop and program them in. And mapping, I've never really messed around with mapping. As I said, that's kind of an overkill feature for this system. So let's go to card. We can edit the NACs and the wiring class. So if we go to NAC 1, it's set. You can set NACs as audible, which will silence when you press the silence button. Visible, which is basically the same as non-silenceable. Common alarm out. I'm not really sure what the difference between that and audible is, and just standard output. So let's exit that menu. We don't want to save. We can configure detectors. So I'm not going to do that right now, but you could enter, as I mentioned, there's a couple different ways to program addressable devices. You can enter the device address, which is that 3-digit number, or you can actually enter in the serial number. Just like all barcodes have a serial number, all EST SIGA devices have their own serial number that's unique, specific to that device. So it will never change, which is very handy, because if you've got a device that you don't know the address of and you want to program it, you just pull it off its base, you check it, and the serial number will always be that. So let's exit. We can configure modules. That's for the addressable modules that I showed you on the inside of the panels, and pull stations are also lumped into that as well. And the rest of the options we already talked about. So let's exit that mode. We've got zones. This is for grouping multiple initiating devices into one group. And as I said, I don't have any zones set, so it's just going to show a list of nothing. Let's get out of this. We have outputs. These are output groups. It doesn't use the word group, but on other panels you would see the word group. That's basically what it is. And we have 2 output groups here. One of them is for the non-coded strobe circuit, and the other is for the audible circuit, which is the voice evacuation system. And because it's a voice evacuation system, it's just set to continuous. But if we wanted to edit one of these circuits, I think this is the strobe circuit, you can change individual responses. And this is basically, it sets what the notification appliance circuit does when an alarm condition comes in. Now this what you're seeing here is very, very simple compared to what you can actually do with the software. You can set all sorts of cross-zoning, Boolean logic, all kinds of stuff like that, but it's just pretty simple on the front panel. So we can set conditions for active alarms or trouble conditions if you want something to go off when a trouble comes in. And there's no I think this is a bug here. There's no edit. You can only add and remove. So every time you want to change a group condition, you have to remove it and then go back and add a new one. So for that reason, I'm not going to edit it to show you what it is. So let's just exit. We don't want to save. And that's the last option left on the configure menu. So let's go. I guess the only option is to save, even though we didn't change anything, so we'll just do that. And now the panel has rebooted. Now, something interesting about this panel, when you press the reset button, it actually doesn't reboot. All it does is just reset, but you don't have to go through the whole warm-up process like on other panels. But what it just did there was basically cut power temporarily and do a warm restart, as Simplex would describe it. And as I mentioned, this is what the monitor light does. You can see line initialization. Let's just silence that. And it has a code for buzzer, which no other panel seems to have that. And that will eventually go away. And I believe that's about it for the programming side of the panel. I'm going to go back through real quick and see if there's anything I've missed. I feel like there is something I didn't get to, but we'll see. Okay, just a few more things on the programming menu. We've got the time and date. We can edit the time and date. It's pretty self-explanatory. We can edit the passcodes. There are 4 levels of passcodes on this panel. Level 1, 2, 3, and 4. And they basically will give you access to increasing levels of functions on the panel, with 4 being programming. And that menu always wants to quit too soon. The restart command, that basically just warm restarts the system. And then we've got clear history, which I'm going to do that right now. So let's enter the panel ID. It's 1. And sometimes the QuickStart doesn't look like it's actually doing anything. It's actually clearing the history right now, but it didn't give any sort of like, okay, I'm clearing the history message or anything. It just kind of quits, which can be a little bit unnerving because you never know when it's just going to like freeze and you're going to have to restart it. I don't really know who would have allowed this version of software to pass through the company. There's so many bugs in it. But even though there are a few downfalls to this panel, all in all, it's a pretty nice panel when it works. The later version, the 2.0 version, is much more stable. And I believe there's a way you can upgrade the firmware to that. And I even have the firmware to that on my computer. And I also have the utility that allows you to upgrade it, but I've never tried, just because I've never run into any issues on this panel. But looks like everything's back to normal now. So I hope you enjoyed this little video. If you are interested in seeing more videos like this, if you'd like me to make some more on some of the other panels I have, just let me know in the comments and I will certainly do so. So thank you for watching.